A very warm welcome to all of you. I'm Vikram. I'm part of the communications and outreach team at Kriya University. And I welcome you to the fifth webinar in the series, which is called Kriya Engage. So now, the world as we know it has changed and all of us have to evolve. And in outreach at Kriya, we've also tried to, be connected with all our stakeholders, whether it's schools, educators, teachers, students, parents. And that's when we thought of doing these webinars. Ideally, we'd be and those would be in individual schools in different cities. But now I think through these webinars, we can reach hundreds of you at a time. We already have about 100 participants on the webinar. So welcome again. I think the topic today is extremely interesting and relevant. And who other than Bharat, Professor Bharat, who can present this topic to us. So today we are going to discuss sustainability in the new normal. This is actually a term I've heard first time from Bharat itself. So he's classified the world in a pre-pandemic and a post-pandemic era. So we will go into a new normal. It's not going to be the same again. But before we get into the discussion, let me introduce Professor Bharat. So Bharat is an assistant professor of environment studies with a PhD from Manipal University. He's an ecologist who enjoys using an interdisciplinary approach to explore and address challenges posed by the dynamism between environment and society. Bharat was previously an assistant professor of human ecology, School of Ecology and Environment Studies at Nalanda University. Bharat combines his training in ecological sciences with the application of theoretical and empirical evidences from related domains like environmental history, subaltern studies, ethnography, and environmental politics to interrogate the roots of our contemporary environmental crisis. His current work includes the long-term monitoring of the socio-economical system in the Western Ghats and a pan-Indian data-driven project on forests, human population and biodiversity conservation, funded by the International Foundation of Science Sweden, International Social Science Council of France, and the National Geographic Society of the USA. So Bharat, I'm not going to take too much of the time in introducing you because I want to know that from you about you. And also before we start, I think let me introduce the topic a little bit. Bharat before has done many sessions for us in environment. One of the previous sessions that he did was environment at the center. But world, as we know, that was a pre-pandemic era. So when we thought of doing this, he said, this is the topic I want to present. So Bharat, why don't you tell us a little bit about your academic journey of how did you develop this interest in environment? What is your background? What are your academic and non-academic interests? A little bit about you.
So first of all, thanks a ton Vikram and Kanchi for organizing this and for calling me. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I really enjoy talking to this virtual audience. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience as well, for which I'm very grateful. I see my previous students from Azim Premji University and from Nalanda University here, so welcome. Very happy to see you. I want to, before I start answering your question, Vikram, I also want to put it upfront out there that a lot of this, what I'm going to be talking to all of you over the next 20-25 minutes or so, has really arisen thanks to the discussions that I've had with my students while teaching two courses this trimester. One course is called Ethics, and the second is called Design Thinking. And both these courses together has really also shaped a lot of the things that I'm going to tell you about sustainability in the next 20-25 minutes. So a big shout out to my students of these two courses. You're the guys who have made these thoughts happen, so thank you very much. So my life as an ecologist, as a person who studies the environment, was a fairly conventional one, in the sense that I grew up in a city. I was born in a city, in the city of Chennai, and pretty much lived there till I was 20 years old, minus the occasional holiday which took me out of Chennai. But I was pretty much a city boy, and like all students, I think, one aspect that doesn't change about student life is that you're wondering what to do after you finish your board exam. And I found myself in the same boat and realized that most conventional pathways were either uninteresting to me or that I was not cut out for it. And you know what it means by being not cut out for it, right? I didn't have enough marks in my board exam to even think of doing engineering or think of doing medicine. So it was pretty clear to me that I wasn't cut out for these professions if they had such a high bar of entry. And what struck me then was I've always been a kind of outdoors person. I've always had much more fun, not just in terms of play, but also in terms of thinking when being outdoors. And the natural world was something that I was curious about. And I then decided to do a bachelor's in botany from a college which was just the nearby compound of my house. So I couldn't jump over the compound, so I had to walk across all the way for almost 2 kilometers to get to the college gate, but it was actually my next compound. 3 years went by like that, and like many other students out there, after your BSc, then what? Right? So again, here was a fork in the road, and I think I was very fortunate to meet up with to be in the class of some excellent professors who taught me about ecology. And of all the courses that I did in my BSc, pretty much the only course I was attracted to was the ecology course. And at that particular time, this is, in the early part of the 21st century, the only place in India where one could study ecology was the School of Ecology in Pondicherry University. And that was really the first time that I left home. And whatever I realized I didn't know about ecology in the class was also strongly supported by the fact that I knew nothing of India and India's natural history, right? So it was basically wanting to know about a very large country and its ecosystems that led me to pick up ecology as a profession. And I mean, many people who now pick up ecology or environment studies as a profession today perhaps would not think twice about it because there are lots of options. There are places you can work, there are places you can study, there are projects you can work on, there are consultancies you can do. So the field is similar now to most conventional fields, but it was not the same thing 20 years ago. And I'm glad that it worked out fine. So I spent almost 4 or 5 years pretty much roaming across the countryside, working with several environmental NGOs, trying to understand the work that they did while working for them. So in the process, I worked for a conservation NGO, another tertiary research NGO, and I finally landed up in the place where I wanted to do my PhD after having seen the country a bit and having arrived at my project. But one part that I should tell you about, and then I think we can move on to Vikram's next question, is that sometime during my journeys of roaming across the countryside, probably the most important thought now in retrospect that struck me was how it is really not possible to disengage people from ecosystems. The vision of unspoiled wilderness landscape that you see on National Geographic or the Discovery Channel is a figment of many people's imagination. When you go into India and you travel across India, the first thing that you realize is that people and ecosystems are present cheek by jowl. And you may not like that, or you may like that, but that's the way it is, right? So that, for me, I think was a very defining moment in my career, now that I look back on it. And it has, in a sense, shaped all of my research work as well through my PhD and after. So that has really been my journey so far. So right now I'm a forest ecologist. I work a lot in the forest. I also look a lot at for sustainability, especially the sustainability of built environments, such as campuses or universities or townships or cities. And I'm also very interested in how environment and society interact, like Vikram mentioned earlier. And what I mean by this interaction is that each of us have an environmental imagination, I think. All of us have an idea about how we want our world to look like environmentally. But the problem is that all of us don't have the same view. All of us have different views. And when these different views clash, they produce several interesting or troubling outcomes. So that's really what I do. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Bharat. Bharat, I think, one of the things that has been always bothering me is that, look what has happened. I just can't still believe, what's happening. The world is transformed. 90% of all of the people on the world are under some kind of a lockdown. We've never had, India probably is the biggest lockdown of history. I mean, 1.3 billion people in houses. All of this has changed everything, right? It's also caused such a huge loss of human life. And look at the economy. I mean, IMF says that we are in a worst of an economic than we were in 2008. So that's changed. There are so many other socio-economic problems that India is facing and the world is facing. So in these conditions, why do you think we should talk about sustainability? Or do you think that is the priority? Why do you think that's the priority right now?
That's a great question, Vikram. When I was trying to articulate this in my own head, the only thought that came into my head was that what we are going through in this pandemic in terms of human distress alone and the loss of human life is perhaps just a teaser trailer of what we might encounter in the future world, which is impacted by climate change, which is resulting from unsustainable activity. So what we're seeing now, the loss of life, the loss of livelihoods, the loss or the hit the economy is taking, the overall human suffering is really just something that is going to happen if we don't do anything about climate change. And if we are to address issues of climate change, we cannot, we have to talk about sustainability in a different way than we have been talking about it so far. So in that sense, I think this is really the best time to talk about sustainability and put it on the table. Because if, we always say that there are crises that are going to happen in the future whose identity that we don't know. But here is a crisis in the future that is going to happen. The climate changed world is going to happen. And we have the data now to understand how it is going to happen. We may not know the specifics, but we have a general idea. And history will not treat us well if we don't react early enough to a crisis which is going to happen not 50 years from now, maybe 60, 70 years from now. But history will not treat us kindly if we do not start reacting to it now. Because unfortunately, climate change is like a ball on a slope. You can't suddenly arrest the movement of the ball because you feel like it. Gravity is going to take over, inertia is going to take over, and the world is going to change. So this is perhaps the best time to act on sustainability.
Sure. Uh, so okay, great. I think that is a very valid point, Bharat, that you brought. And in fact, personally, if you ask me, there never has been a time in the last 10 years that I haven't visited an airport in like a week. And now it's been like a 2.5 months that I'm at home. I'm exploring, things like big basket for the first time. I never buy groceries online, but I'm doing that. So I think it definitely is a time where we can at least have this conversation. Also, can you give us some examples of opportunities that grab to make the world more sustainable going forward?
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to. So I'll start off with the example that you first brought up, this notion of air travel, right? What do we know about air travel? Let me give you some facts and figures to kind of make our conversation flow in a better way. There were around 40 million flights last year alone. Okay. If you take into account the amount of carbon dioxide emissions or fossil fuel emissions that the aviation industry, the passenger aviation industry emits every year, it's almost 2% of the global fossil fuel emissions. So what does that mean? 2% doesn't seem like a lot, right? But if you rank the countries that in their order of high output of carbon dioxide emissions, you all may already know that USA is number one, China is number two, and so on and so forth. India is number three, and so on and so forth. Passenger aviation will come in at number 11. So if passenger aviation was a country, it would be 11 or 11th on the list of the highest carbon dioxide emitters in the world. And passenger aviation has been growing at a staggering rate of almost at the rate of around 5% per year. Okay? So every year there are more flights and flying is becoming cheaper and so on and so forth. Now, one cannot deny that the global economy, the engine of the global economy is fueled a lot by the movement of people, right? I'm able to go for a meeting somewhere, I have a productive meeting and so on and so forth. So it's really, you can't just look at the bad of passenger aviation and say that, you know, it's bad for the world. Of course, it results in some good economic outcomes. But the point is that if this trend is going to continue of passenger aviation rising at the rate of 5% every year, what we're really going to find is that by the year 2050, passenger aviation alone is going to account for almost a quarter or even 1/3 of all emissions of carbon in the world. Right? So 1/3 of all carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions in the world is going to come from passenger air travel. And the problem in a regulatory framework or a governance framework with passenger air travel, that it does not accrue to any single country. I'll repeat that again. So if you ask who is accountable for carbon dioxide emissions from the aviation industry, passenger aviation industry, the answer is nobody. You can't pin it down to any single country saying that, hey, you country, you have to do something about reducing emissions that are coming from passenger air travel. There is no such thing, right? So this basically is a black hole in our regulatory framework. And this has been pointed out by many researchers out there saying that this is a problem. So obviously there is a problem that needs to be addressed. And I believe that this is perhaps the best time in our industrialized history to address this problem. Look at us right now, where there are 136 of us having a conversation over a web interface. Many of you have already submitted questions for me beforehand. Many of you will type in questions for me in the chat box over here. I may not be able to see you, but you are able to see me and hear me, right? This may not be a very good approximation of you attending a public lecture in a nice auditorium in the center of town. But in the absence of any other option, I don't see this as a bad one at all, right? So similarly, if I translate the same thing to air travel for the purposes of attending a meeting of a work, all of us right now, and you will not disagree with me, the ones who are fortunate enough to work from home have all switched to digital interfaces to do our work. And that is a great thing, right? So I see a few windows of opportunity opening up so that we can try and evaluate whether passenger aviation in the frequency that we did fly before is essential or non-essential. And I think we are placed in a perfect position to classify pretty much the large proportion of passenger aviation as non-essential, right? We don't need to go to that half-day meeting, which is 500 kilometers away, when we are perfectly capable of zooming in or through WebEx or whatever else. This is also a great option to think about the unsustainable activities that we have been promoting in the past. Think about frequent flyer miles in the past, right? You're being rewarded for flying more. And I can't think of a more perverse reward in terms of sustainability. And I think we are probably now in a great position to introduce a frequent flyer penalty where you will be penalized for flying too much because you're putting several people at risk, including, in the long term, you're putting the environment at risk as well. So we are, I think, at a position to change some things about our past. And this is really what I mean by the new norm. The second example, Vikram, is the example that you brought up with BigBasket, right? One of the things that I've been trying to do some more research about, but I'm not able to find the data, is the carbon dioxide emissions that arise from the global food distribution network, especially the cold chain network, the global cold chain network. Now, what is the, the food distribution network, right? Many parts of the globe don't grow all the food that they consume. This food has to come from somewhere. And the world's transportation networks basically provide this food through road or through the oceans or through air or through the railways and so on and so forth, right? So that's the food distribution network. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the global cold chain network, which is responsible for the transport of perishable food, right? So I'm talking about vegetables, fruits, and so on and so forth, which all of us consume on a daily basis. But we may not be aware that all of these foods also have a very, very high carbon cost, which is associated from them, with them. So what I want you guys to do the next time you are able to go to a proper market or either a hart or a market or a supermarket, the best would be a street market. Go to your vendor and ask him or her where these potatoes came from, where these tomatoes came from, where this apple came from, where this banana came from, and just total up your list, right? At home, make a list of whatever you consume at home and put down distances near it. And my guess is that you will find that some of these items arrive from a very, very, very far distance away. And the only way that that apple can reach you in the state that is in, crunchy and fresh, is because it is refrigerated for the entire journey. There is no other way that perishable good can reach you in such a state unless it is transported through the cold chain. Now, of course, the cold chain is a savior for our agriculturists, right? So just similar to air travel, I'm not saying that the cold chain is bad. It's brilliant for agriculturalists, especially who are growing perishable goods, because otherwise you're going to lose all the goods that you produce. It's going to rot. But the flip side of this is that when you decide to transport these goods across 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers or 10,000 kilometers, the carbon cost is staggering, right? So somebody who did a study way back in 2010, and that's the only study I could find about the global cold chain, pointed out that if you total up or estimate the emissions from this cold chain industry, it's almost 1% of the global carbon dioxide emission. So half of the passenger aviation industry, 1%, is emitted by our consumption of our need to consume exotic fruits and vegetables, right? Now, that's not the only thing. Remember, I told you that these are perishable goods, right? So it's not as if all the perishable goods survive the journey. A study from Great Britain, which was done in 2018, indicated that almost 30% of all goods which are transported over the cold chain are thrown away because they rot. 30%, that's almost 1/3, right? And that again is a staggering number for me, because remember that our food production is also very, very carbon concentrated. We're pumping water using electricity. We're irrigating the land using electricity. We're plowing the soil using diesel power. We're transporting the goods using diesel power, and so on and so forth. So the carbon cost of all of this food is also very expensive. And when 1/3 of it gets thrown away, that's a phenomenal waste, right? Which only adds to the problem. So again, I think this pandemic is a brilliant opportunity to reevaluate our need to consume food that has come from so far away. Maybe if we choose to consume food that is produced locally, not only can we address the future effects of climate change, but it'll also be more sustainable to local producers, right? So it'll also be sustainable to local farmers, to local suppliers, to local stockists, and to local shops. So these are two examples that come immediately to mind, Vikram. And I think if we as individuals do decide to do something about this, we can.
Sure. I think that was great, Bharat. There are so many questions that are coming to my mind that I just want to ignore everybody else's questions and ask mine myself. But just, one question that's coming out of this: what about the whole experience economy? I mean, people have built industries. There's Airbnbs. When we travel, I think the most exciting thing for me when I travel is to experience another country, culture, language. What about that? I mean, is there an ethical implication that you're showing me and asking me not to travel? I mean, how do you counter that?
So recreational travel is a really difficult thing, and I really agree with you, Vikram. It's really, I think, unfair to place such a constraint on the human condition, saying that please restrain your curiosity, please restrain your happiness. So this is one reason why a lot of people who talk about sustainability are put on the same platform as economists who say doomsday is going to happen, right? So if you put, like, if you go to a room full of academicians, the people that everyone doesn't like are usually the economists and the sustainability people, because we're always saying bad things and we're always telling you not to do things. But that's really not what I had in mind, right? So I'm not talking of really a complete cancellation of all these things, but I am arguing for a more mindful application of all of these things, right? I think many of us are probably not aware of the effects of our own actions. On the same token, I don't think many governments want to be aware of the implications of their own actions, right? So to give you an example of why governments may not want to act, I don't think they want to let airline companies go belly up right now. They don't want them to go bust because too much depends on it. But what I'm arguing for is that it's okay if it goes bust if it leaves behind a few more responsible operators, right? So here is a horror story for you about passenger aviation. After the worldwide ban, so pretty much all the countries in the world locked down after India announced its lockdown, right? So at some point in time, I think something like almost 4 billion people in the world were locked down. This happened around, I think, 24 or 25 days ago. I went to a site called Flight Radar. Now, Flight Radar is a site that tracks passenger aviation all across the world. And I looked at the US data, right? The US still had 80% of the flights flying when almost the entire country was locked down, right? And the reason that they had to keep flights going, and they call these ghost flights, the reason that they had to keep these flights up in the air with no people in them was because of government laws that said that you will cease to be able to access your airspace if you don't run these routes, right? So there were 80% of the normal flights in the US were flying without passengers. And I think that is, phenomenally ridiculous. So I'm not arguing, but to return to your earlier point about recreation travel, I'm not arguing for a cancellation of travel for recreation. Maybe there are places that you can go to by train. Maybe there are places you can go to by bus, which are nice, right? Many of us, and I don't know, I don't think I am alone here, but sometimes I feel that I know more about other countries than my own country. Because I've traveled more often to other countries or traveled widely across other countries better. At one certain point in time, my knowledge of the geography of Thailand was much better than the geography of India, right? And that had to do with the amount of traveling that I did in Thailand compared to India. So here is a great chance to change that again, right? Because you're supporting local businesses, local Airbnbs, and so on and so forth. And maybe this is a great chance for us to also realize the pleasure that comes from travel, from relaxed travel. I found myself incapable of sitting in a train journey for 2 days. I tried it around 2 years ago and I gave up because I just couldn't. I think flight travel just makes you incapable of doing that. But I still remember how much I enjoyed traveling by train when I was a child. Right? I would read like 4 books in a 2-day journey. I miss that, and I wish I could get back to that.
Thank you. So Bharat, coming back to what we are, right, a university. So kind of concentrating the topic around that. So what do you think higher education can do? How can we play a role, in understanding various issues pertaining to sustainability? I mean, I'm not even talking about the K-12 space or schools, because according to the surveys again, almost only 15% of Indian households actually have internet. So I'm not talking about K-12, but what about higher education?
That's a great question. There's so much uncertainty about that. And I think a lot of the new normal is really going to do with the way that we engage with learners. And learners could be anyone, right? It could be, like you said, school people. It could be higher education, whatever, adults, mid-career professionals who are looking to reskill themselves, uh, people who have suddenly found opportunities open up online because a lot of things are happening online right now. So there's going to be quite a bit of emphasis placed on teaching and learning online. And again, I think we are in a position where we can do a hell of a lot about changing the space and making the space evolve in a way that is desirable. So just before coming onto this meeting, for example, I was on another Kriya event which went on. I had to leave that event because mine was about to start. Paula Mariwala was talking, who's on our board of trustees, board of management, sorry, was talking to us about how we are in a position where we can take a few risks and try out a few models of teaching and learning and see how that goes. So one example of that, immediately one very tangible example, could be to take the worst case scenario and say that, okay, students are not going to come back to me next trimester, right? The university is going to remain closed, but teaching and learning will continue, right? So I can engage with my students over a Zoom classroom pretty well, and I have been doing over the last 10 weeks as well, trying to engage with them online. And it's not it is challenging in terms of the technological aspects that you need to master, the glitches that you encounter, also the inadequacy of interacting over an online space. But all of these are surmountable in various ways, right? It's not as if it's not surmountable. Most of us are already very, very literate in terms of communicating over WhatsApp or over email. And Zoom is just a natural progression then, where we talk, interact, discuss. And if you really, for a minute, forget where you are and you are sitting in a nice room by yourself in a quiet space, it is actually possible for you to transport yourself mentally to imagine the real thing. That's one. The second is that I think this crisis, and particularly linking it again with sustainability, opens up education for really interdisciplinary applications of mind, right? So what I mean by that is that let's say I put an economist in a room, a social scientist in a room, a historian in the room, and a humanities person or a literature and arts person in the room, and ask them the question, how can we reimagine a more sustainable world in the future given this pandemic? The answers that we can come up with today, I think, are far more tangible and specific thanks to the human experience of living through this pandemic, right? We could not have imagined thinking about how normal this Zoom conversation feels 3 months ago. I mean, we would have looked at each other as if we were from outer space if I had said this to you 3 months ago that, I'm going to have a webinar and I'm going to be interacting with 132 people, right? So, but what does it mean in terms of going back to my sustainability question? What does it mean, right? So let's take my passenger aviation question. I wasn't being perverse when I said that it's better if some airline companies shut down. An economist would argue that from a purely cost-benefit analysis point of view, it's actually better that we don't have inefficient resources which are deployed on the ground. It's actually better if we reduce the amount of resources that are deployed on the ground that require constant maintenance, that require a lot of staff, and so on. And therefore, we might actually be able to work with one or two large airlines that supply all of us. Right? Similarly, in terms of supermarkets and buying groceries and so on, it's not as if I'm arguing for a no supermarket scenario, but I am arguing for a supermarket scenario where there is a certain tendency for the producing company or the company that owns the supermarket to buy things locally in their own interest, right? You're saving more money because you're buying locally, you're spending less money transporting the goods, you're getting local produce, etc., etc., right? So all of these things would be looked upon by an economist very favorably. An ecologist, on the other hand, may say that, hello, hold on, the kinds of crops that we're growing today is not at all appropriate for the landscape that we live in, right? So people who live in Maharashtra can't live on sugarcane. And he or she may argue for a gradual shifting away from sugarcane back to the crops that were grown pre-sugarcane, jawar, bajra, millet, and so on and so forth, right? So I think this really, so once you have a crisis like this, I see all kinds of educational opportunities like this opening up in terms of how people can apply themselves in a more concrete, in a more specific manner. And I'm really excited by that as well. Now, literature and arts people are always also worried about the environment in their own way, right? And the argument in their field has also been that they haven't paid enough attention to climate change, to contemporary issues of climate change. That is very rapidly changing, right? So when Amitav Ghosh wrote his book, The Great Derangement, 3 years ago, I think there was a lot of emphasis that he placed on why isn't the literary imagination responding to climate change. And in that intervening period between then and now, there have been so many books written by writers about what we are facing right now with climate change. Right? So in that sense, I see a lot, or rather I see a crisis like this, which prompts a lot of people from diverse backgrounds to come together in ways that they were perhaps not doing before.
Great, Bharat. Thank you so much for that. And I think we've consumed more time than we had allocated for this, but let's quickly jump to questions. So Bharat, we've shortlisted a couple of questions that had come to us in the registration form, and we have about 4 or 5 people who want to ask you these questions.
Sure,
So
happy.
can I first invite Dr. Gunisetti Srinivas? He works I'm with one of the Andhra Pradesh government organizations and has a very interesting question. Dr. Srinivas, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sundaram?
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, definitely.
Please
Fine, sir. Yeah, this is Dr. Gunesh Srinivasulu from Andhra Pradesh, sir. Basically, I'm working for SCRT Andhra Pradesh in the Department of School Education as a resource person and trainer of trainers and module developer.
Wonderful.
My question is, now due to the occurrence of this pandemic COVID-19, the entire world has, as you said, has become two distinct stages, that is world before COVID and after COVID, right? So my question is, due to the occurrence of this COVID-19, now the entire, the ecosystem, the environment, there is so much of, changing scenario. So the entire, see, what is the positive and negative impact on environment in terms of ecological balance, El Nino effect, global warming, CO2 ghost, and cleanliness and human health, and deforestation and all these things. So what would be the ground reality in future scenario after this? So can you explain, please?
Sir, very nice question, and thank you for asking that question. So I want to concentrate on the short term. I will split your question into 2 parts, right? So I'll try and talk about the short term effects of this lockdown, and then talk about what long term effects it may have in the future. So a lot of you out there, I think a lot of your WhatsApp feeds or your Instagram feeds are full of how the environment across the world is seemingly improving, right? Because all of us are sitting at home. But have you thought about the fact that you are probably seeing things that you didn't see before because you're sitting at home?
Yeah.
The animals were always there, but it's only now that you're seeing them because hiding from you in the dark, they are now out on the road, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second is to make this distinction between the reduction in pollution with the non-reduction in fossil fuel emission, right? So all of us are right now sitting in our houses, consuming electricity, using our air conditioners, powering our homes. So the amount of coal or oil that we are burning to generate electricity has not really come down a great deal. We are still doing all those things. But we have reduced the amount of vehicles that are on the road. There are hardly any vehicles on the road. There are no trains running. There are no buses running. So your major polluters are all off the roads, which is why you're seeing a huge difference in environmental parameters like air quality. The air quality is really superb now wherever you go in the country, right? You go out to your terrace today evening, you will see stars in the sky like you never have before. You would have been
Right.
noticing these things, right? But all of these things are short term because they don't take a lot of time to get back to the normal situation of a high pollution situation, right?
Right.
As an environmental scientist, I'm also very worried about the increase in polluting activities once activities begin again, right? Because people are suddenly already we have made changes in the rules under which our factories will work. Before it was an 8-hour shift, but now it will be a 12-hour shift. So all of this is going to result in a pretty heavy increase in pollution as well. As for deforestation, again, the news is not very good because a lot of environmental clearances are being given by our own government now at a far rapid pace than ever before, right? So a lot of land is also being cleared in many other parts of the world. So deforestation is also not really reducing that much. So in terms of climate change for the future, this we are already. So I'm let me give you some little bit more tangible data here. The Paris Climate Accord, which was signed in 2015, basically wanted to limit the increase in global temperature by 1.5 degrees above the industrial normal by 2050. Okay, that was their intention. So the industrial revolution, let's say, started in 1850 or 1860, and the temperature was something then. So the Paris Accord doesn't want to increase the temperature by more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, more than that temperature that was there in 1850, 1860. But all the data so far points out that we are already on track for a 2.5 or 3 degree change in temperature within the next 60, 70 years, right? So a lockdown for 3 months is not going to really solve any of this because we are
There would
already,
be a sudden increase in demand.
there will be a sudden increase in demand, and we are already on a trajectory where this is just a very small blip. This is just almost a small, minuscule blip. It's like
Thank you
so it's like an
much.
exponential curve, sir. You must have seen many exponential curves related to COVID, right? There'll be a small bend in the curve, but the curve is actually still going up, 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 up. So this is exactly like that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Srinivas. Bharat, we have like a ton of questions coming towards you.
Sure.
Let me
Happy to.
invite the
We have
next
plenty of.
person now. Urjit, are you there? Urjit, can you just unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask your question?
Hello. Yes, sir. Sir, so my name is Rujit. I study in grade 9 and I'm from Shivnada School, Noida. So I'm good. So I have a deep interest in automotive design and automobiles. So I've been designing some of them for my competition, that is F1 in schools. So I've also been a part of MUNs. So it gives me a great knowledge about the environment as I've been a part of UNEP. So, sir, my question to you is that say that you have been doing many projects in the Western Ghats, social ecological projects in the Western Ghats. Sir, I realize that there are many historically marginalized communities there which are isolated and which don't want to come in the mainstream society. So, how have your projects affected their lives, or how have they reacted to your interference in their ecosystem?
That's a lovely question. Thank you for asking that question. And I actually have to go back a fair deal now in history because I started my fieldwork in the year 2000. So I spent around a year and a half in Arunachal Pradesh and Assam during that time. Then I spent another 2 years or so in central India near Tadoba and Melghat and Pench and Panna. And then after that, I went to Andhra Pradesh where I spent a lot of time, almost a year and a half, before I finally landed up in my PhD site, which was in the Western Ghats. That was in 2005, 2006. And I've been going there over the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years or so, right? So my answer to you is also a kind of a reflection of that journey. And what I've noticed about indigenous people pretty much all over India is that they really probably exited the mainstream once mobile networks became more accessible. You know, almost everyone. So I got my mobile phone in the year 2004, right? That was my first mobile phone, and by that at that time it was still expensive to make a call and to keep your connection going and so on and so forth. But in a very, very rapid time after that, between let's say 2006 and 2010, mobile telephony has become so affordable that I very rarely see people without them wherever I go in India. And it plays a huge role, and that combined with, let's say, satellite television plays a huge role in changing our own perspective about whether these people are not mainstream anymore or not. So I don't consider any of the people in India who as non-mainstream. Almost every single person now has access to the media, to the internet in some form, or at least to satellite television, right? But what I have seen, and this you have raised as well, is that many of them are really very marginalized in the sense they suffer from poverty. Many, you know, that if you look at the data, then almost 50% of the Indian population lives on an income of less than $1 a day. So most of the people that you would find in indigenous areas are similar kinds of people. So obviously there are, you know, very pressing poverty alleviation concerns that they face. But on the other hand, they are, when I ask them how your lives were 20 years ago versus now, almost all of them, the bulk of them say that our lives have got better in terms of medical care, in terms of access to the market, in terms of access to transportation networks. The world has only got better for them, right? So maybe if you, when you get the chance, you should start, you know, traveling a little more and meet up with people a little more to understand where they are coming from, and maybe that will help. But my own research is not interventionist in nature. So most of my research, for example, has to do with interviewing people, to go with them to the field, to learn how to identify plants or birds with them, and so on. So most of my work is not really interventionist in nature. So, you know, my research has not negatively impacted anybody. My research may have positively impacted the community that I worked with for my PhD, because a lot of my forest ecology work actually goes to point out that they have a lot of indigenous local knowledge that is being ignored by other people, and that should not happen. So I haven't had negative influences so far in my research, and I'm very happy about that. And I've had a few positive impacts. Thank you for your question, Urjit.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Urjit. In fact, the things that, so yesterday I was watching a video about from BBC about the Spanish flu, and they said the first time after the Spanish flu is when people started thinking about accessible public health system. So there are always silver linings in everything.
Yeah.
Uh, but thank you, Urjit. Can we now have Mehak Mehta? Mehak, can you line and ask your question, please?
Hello, sir. Thank you for the wonderful webinar that you had given us. My name is Mehak, and I'm a class 12 geography student from La Martiniere for Girls, Kolkata. Sir, if we see through the eyes of nature lovers, we can think that there are few positive effects that the current pandemic has on the environment. And as the quote goes, that the hardest climb, the best view comes after the hardest climb. So, sir, what is your views on the existing governmental laws on environment that may change after the pandemic?
Oh, that's a very good question, Mehak, and I'm going to be very careful when I answer that, because this is not the best time for people to talk about the environment in India, particularly with relation to governmental policy. Some of you may have heard about the Italian hydropower project, which is happening in Arunachal Pradesh, and this is so the problem. I'll tell you the problem in as clear a way as possible. The problem is that governmental policy is being made during this pandemic with relation to the environment. And this is a problem because public participation in the process of evaluating whether a project or not is essential in any democracy, right? So technically, the government cannot go ahead with a project that requires environmental clearance, such as the cutting down of forests or the diversion of a river or the displacement of an indigenous people, without taking into account the local stakeholders' opinion. So the problem with many such environmental clearance activity that is happening currently in India is that it is being pushed through in haste when it should not be, right?
Correct.
That's one huge issue. But the good thing also is, or rather, one of the things that have pushed back against this kind of a thing happening is a very strong uh, online presence of activists that have been calling these behaviors out repeatedly. And as far as the Italian project goes, it has been kind of put on hold by the government after severe pushback from a group of activist researchers. So that I see as a good thing, right? But going to the second part of your question, which is about the future, I'm not really sure because if you look at the history of India and the history of how India has treated the environment itself, the data is not that great, right? Economic crises have globally as well always resulted in environmental degradation. So, the short-term outlook on the environment is not good, I'm afraid, if history were to repeat itself. But at the same time, all that said, India being a signatory to the Paris Climate Accord and also to talk about common but differentiated responsibility when dealing with climate change in the future, will also, as if they walk the talk, then they have already done things, a lot of things, which will make our climate affected future a little more resilient. We have put in a lot of projects for green energy. We've done quite a bit in that space. So to answer your question in summary, I would say both good and bad, but mostly bad.
Thank you, Mac. Now we have the final question, that is a direct question. Then we'll quickly take questions from chat because it's just piling up. So we have Dinesh now. Dinesh is a law student, not at all interested in applying to CREA, of course, but he has a very interesting question. Dinesh, come on. You can go ahead and ask your question. Dinesh, can you hear us?
I don't think he's around.
Yes, I don't think he's on. Okay, so then we'll start taking questions.
Dinesh is on.
Dinesh is on. Very good.
Yes, hi Dinesh. Yeah, go ahead, ask your question. Dinesh, I think you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Ranjit, can we unmute him?
Sir, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Please repeat your question from the start.
Sir, first of all, good evening to you. I'm a student of law studying at SV University Tirupati. So
you're just hardly 70 kilometers away.
No, sir. Actually, I live in Naidupeta, so I'm much near.
Oh, Naidupeta is even closer by. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Please tell me.
Sir, firstly, I have a brief view to present to you. In fact, I'm quite optimistic about the future. There are so many reasons to be so. I mean, in the terms of the amount of leapfrogging that happened when it comes to renewable sources of energy, and also there are reports that in some of the regions in Europe, there is actually the forest has been I mean, it is increasing in area.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the amount of innovation that's happening actually going back 3 decades, solar panels were used in satellites,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So in the time of 3 decades now, it is also under my home's roof. So much has happened. I am quite optimistic about it. And coming to my question, sir, why the grasslands are not given enough priority when it comes to being reported in the Indian Forest Report? Because I have learned that they do a good job when it comes to fixing the carbon into soil.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Uh, Thank you,
yeah.
Dinesh. I think, and thank you for the first statement that you made, because I think it's very important to recognize that many, many positive things are also happening in the world with relation to a more sustainable future. So, thank you very much for acknowledging that and for pointing that out. Your second question is more specific to forests in India. So I'm going to give a very, very quick context to the rest of the audience. So approximately 21% of India is forest. Okay. And of that 21%, around 60 to 70% is something called tropical dry forest. Just around 2 or 3% is rainforest. The remaining 20 odd percent is a mixture of secondary forest, plantations, and uh, grasslands. These grasslands may be high altitude grasslands that are seen in Leh and Ladakh and Himachal Pradesh, or they could be low altitude grasslands which are present in many areas of Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. Right. So the grasslands that Dinesh is referring to are the grasslands in the lowland areas or the sea level areas. And I couldn't agree with you more, Dinesh. I think it's even the grasslands in Rajasthan, for example. Uh, these areas are very, very important from multiple points of view. They are very important for local biodiversity. They are very important for carbon sequestration. They're extremely important for herbivores. They're very, very important for agriculturalists and pastoralists. And this is a particular ecosystem that is under heavy threat right now. And the good thing, though, is that there are several institutions in India, and I can name a few for you. One is the National Center for Biological Sciences. The next is the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. The third is Nature Conservation Foundation. All of these three are looking at these kinds of grasslands through their regular research, through their intensive research. So many people have flagged this idea, flagged this problem. So hopefully it will be something that the government recognizes very soon.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dinesh.
Dinesh. Okay, so we'll get into the chat now, Bharat.
Sure.
So we have a question from Aishwarya Srihari. She says,
Sure.
given that the economy has been hit quite hard during the lockdown and that prior to COVID-19 situation, the Indian economy was seeing a slowdown, the government is very likely to push industries to work harder and contribute higher to the GDP.
Yeah.
This will see impacts on the environment. In this scenario, how will sustainability play out? What will be some of the measures we could take?
Yeah. So so Aishwarya, this is a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. But the problem is that I can't give you any kind of a specific or clear answer about this because it may play out either way, right? So look at a few examples. You go to a intensive care unit of any chain hospital in India. By chain hospital, I mean a private hospital. And go into the intensive care unit, you'll find a ventilator. And this ventilator would have been manufactured in some other country, right? It's imported. Uh, I forget the country, but I read 2-3 days ago that there's one country which had before the pandemic the monopoly on producing ventilators. That has changed rapidly, right? Mahindra and Mahindra came up with a low cost budget ventilator design, which they're putting into play right now. So they're thinking of producing a ventilator for 7,000, 8,000 rupees. So it's going to be crazy in terms of the kinds of efficiencies and jugaad that people do to get back on track. Now, some of these efficiencies and jugaad may actually result in the lower consumption of resources, while some of them, I don't know, may result in the higher consumption of resources. Right? So we must also remember that production will, at some point in time, have to also track consumption, and consumption right now is at a worldwide low. Right? So to give you an example of that, India basically consumed 20% of the fuel that it consumed last year and during the same month. Right? We consumed 1/5 of the fuel. That's how much we're consuming right now. On the other hand, the few of us who are lucky enough to be able to have access to markets and food are eating quite well. So there is one part of the consumption still going on. So my quick answer to you, Aishwarya, is going to be that you're going to find answers on both sides of the spectrum. I think there will be an increase in efficiencies in some sectors, and there may be a decrease in efficiencies in some sectors.
Thank you, Bharat. The next question is from Anunya Kastliwal. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So she says, can you suggest some sources to refer for studying the carbon emission of foodstuff and cold chain?
Well, get in touch with me offline and let's talk about it a little bit more, because I haven't been able to find much data at all, especially when it comes to related to India. So I remember a student of mine from Nalanda University, Tatsama, if you're still here, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but he was working on, for example, preventing the destruction of agricultural produce by working on solar powered refrigerant units at the farm level or at the village level. Right? But I don't think he found any data about India as well. So not much data, a lot, which is actually good news for people like me, because there's a lot of room for doing new research there.
Thank you. So the next question is from Vinay. He says, could you recommend undergraduate courses in environment and ecology which students from either commerce or humanities backgrounds can join?
Fantastic, yeah. So what you need to do is to look for a place with a liberal arts and science curriculum, right? You need to have the freedom to choose to take a few courses from the environment studies, from biology, from ecology, maybe environmental economics, maybe environmental law, while still pursuing your primary interest, which may be in commerce or whatever else, right? So you really need to look for a place that offers you these kinds of options.
Thank you. I think we also offer a course in environment, and Bharat, of course, teaches that. So you can look.
We don't offer commerce.
Yes, no. So he's saying somebody with a background in commerce can apply for environment studies.
Okay, so but this is for the master's level or for the bachelor's level?
Undergraduate level.
Undergraduate level. Okay, yeah. Then this is a good place to come to, man. Environment studies. You can study economics.
So we have another question from Sai Balaji. So Sai, I know, is an enrolled student. He's accepted at Kriya and he's joined us for next year. So he asks, how consider a change in the use of natural and human resources in the post-COVID world?
How would I consider the change in the use?
Yes.
Can you repeat the question,
Natural
Vikram?
and human resources.
Can you repeat the question, Vikram? I didn't get it entirely.
So he asks, how would you consider a change in the use of natural and human resources in the post-COVID world?
Okay, I still didn't get the question, because would I consider the change to be good or to be bad, or the change itself? I don't know. But natural resources, I think I kind of answered the previous person. I think it was a person from Kolkata. I forgot her name. I'm sorry. Mehak, I think. Was it?
Yes.
Yes, Mehak, who raised this question about the short and long-term impacts of COVID on the environment. So basically, short-term, we may see improvement in environmental quality and so on. But long term, we're still on a trajectory that is taking us towards 3 degrees of climate change within the next 60, 70 years. So short answer to your question, more when you come here, Sai Balaji.
So we have a question from Varsha now. Varsha says, do you think the public memory of pure air now will remain with them, or will it just be lost in fresh pollution? I think the larger question she's trying to ask is this a short-term change in everything, or do you think this will last?
I am not very sure this is going to last once we return to a normal production system, because it's not as if things have magically changed during this pandemic that has made our infrastructure less polluting. Right? So it's just that all these systems are right now idling; they're switched off. When all of this comes back on, we're just going to go back to what was there before, probably a little bit more. So, I'm sorry, but the pessimist in me is coming out, and I'm not, I may not be giving you the answer that you wanted to hear.
Thank you. So there's a question from it says in the
Hi,
history of our
Sangeeta.
presence.
Long time. I met her in Bangalore the last time. No, she's a friend.
Okay, okay. She said in the history of our presence, we seem to be good in figuring our stop gaps, finding a temporary solution for a permanent problem. How does one bring in the middle path in sustainability and development? I think you sort of answered this question, but would you like to add anything else?
So the bad word that people don't use very much is the word inequality when you're talking about sustainability, right? So the new normal that many people are talking about out there also is a world which has lower levels of inequality than it did previously. So a lot of people have in fact pointed out that there was no normal before. What was there before was abnormal, and what we can go towards is an actual new normal, right? So if you read Piketty, then you'll see that we are living right now in perhaps the most inequitous moment of history, where the gap between the richest person and the poorest person who lives on earth is probably around 300 or 400 orders of magnitude. You can fit 30% of the world's wealth into the passengers who sit in a 30% bus, right? So 30%, 30 people own 30% of the globe's wealth. And we've never had a situation like this in the world before. So many people argue that whatever we do about sustainability has to be extremely strongly linked to measures to reduce the inequality and the inequity that is present in human society so far.
Thank you. So next, Chirag asks a question. He
Chirag
says, "Sir,
Singhal.
Chirag Singhal, yes.
Our Chirag. Hi, Chirag. I haven't seen you in class in a long time because you're not in my section. That's okay. You're not cutting my class. I know. We're just not.
How big a role will technology play in sustainability right now, accounting for the fact that the importance of simple solutions while sitting at home?
I don't know if they're so simple, man. I mean, look at the back end to a Cisco WebEx event like this, right? There's stuff that we can't see that is making this WebEx event happen. So I'm not quite sure that it's going to be simple, but it will be simple in the sense that I'm thinking of a future world where we can, for example, work from our homes, but do high-tech stuff, right? The laptop that you are looking at right now was unimaginable 45 years ago, right? The amount of RAM that the first moon mission had was 16 KB of RAM. With 16 KB of RAM, they put a man on the moon. And if you look at our mobile phones right now, they have more computing power than the first computer had, right? So things are going to I think things are going to remain complex from a technological point of view, but I would think of your question more as things becoming more simplistic at the individual human level. And I think we should chat more about this when you come back. I would love to have a chat with you about this.
Thank you. So we'll try to cover as many questions. We have 6 minutes to go. We do like sort of a rapid fire now.
Yeah.
So Anunya again asks, she has very beautiful questions. I don't know who she is, or she's a student or a parent. She says, how do you draw a line between human rights and conservation? How often do you find yourself in a situation where human rights groups oppose conservation efforts? I think this really brings to a question that I also had, Bharat, about what is right. I mean, what is okay? What is an ethical or like that perspective in all of this?
Fantastic question,
Yeah.
Anunya. um, and Vikram. So when I started off working in this field, it was obviously through for many of the reasons that are very normal, right? I love seeing wildlife. I love seeing forests. I love seeing scenery. I love seeing a river in its full flow. And when I first started working in this field, I hated seeing human beings in natural environments. I just felt they didn't belong, right? But the more and more you spend time in the field, is when you realize that there is a very clear difference between what academicians in my field will call conservation versus preservation. So the preservationists are basically the ones who will argue for a place to be set aside completely from any kind of human presence or human impact. So think of, the North Pole, the South Pole, many uninhabited islands in the world, and so on and so forth. That is where a preservationist argument will work. Even there, it might not work because the carbon dioxide that we're emitting into the atmosphere is going to affect these ecosystems as well eventually. But the conservationist argument, on the other hand, is largely not exclusionary argument. An actual conservationist argument is for people and nature to live together and to reduce the friction between people and nature. And this is often forgotten even by people within my field, right? So I find it very useful to recall this every now and then. But I come also from a academic tradition where we do not consider work that affects the human rights of people in the areas where we work as ethically acceptable. The academic discipline that I am from will severely, clamp down on any kind of work that impacts the human rights of the people who live in that environment, right? And this also has to do with breaking down some earlier cliches about indigenous people themselves. Many of us look at indigenous people, we romanticize them, we think of them as a noble savage who wants to lead a life of ecological balance and will preserve all biodiversity and will take care of wildlife. The reality is nothing like that. I've seen several people who do all kinds of illegal things in forests. I've also seen several kinds of people who will do illegal things in cities. They are people. People do things, right? And there's no point in attributing value judgments to any of them, especially if you don't live in that area, right? So many people in my field now have a far more articulate understanding of the linkages between human rights and conservation than they did even a decade ago. So, and I'm very happy for that progress that we've made.
Thank you, Bharat. I think we have time for just the last question. It's from, we have a lot, but we'll just take the last one. So this is from Nicola Das. She's from JB Petit in Bombay. She asks, does biotechnology help in bettering the environment in any way?
That's a lovely question, Mekla, because in my ethics course, we had a module on bioethics around 3 years ago. And one of the parts that we discussed, or one of the papers that we discussed, was the role played by biotechnology and genetically modified organisms in our lives, right? And we kind of reached a nice argumentative position by saying that, let's say that you've invented an organism that can make the life of a human being or human beings better. Then are you against the creation of that organism, or are you against the economic model that sells this organism for profit? Right? You get my argument? Let's say you create a lovely variety of rice that can grow under saline conditions using very little water. Are you worried about the process by which this variety of rice was created? You're messing with nature, you're messing with genes, you're creating a new variety and so on, using tools that scientists didn't have access to even 5 years ago. Are you worried about that? Or are you worried about companies like Monsanto who will sell this rice at a huge rate to farmers who can't afford it? If you distinguish between these two strands, then you can progress with your argument a little bit more, right? If you argue, if you have a lot against the economic model that sells genetically modified organisms, then maybe it's the economic model that we need to make better. On the other hand, if you think that nature shouldn't be messed with and you should leave nature to itself, then you have other issues to think about, like, let's say, the precautionary principle, which says that you do not do genetic modification unless you're absolutely sure that it will have no effects on the organisms around it. Right? So either way, it's a good way to progress with the argument. So you can't make an argument saying, oh, it's bad, oh, it's good, right? We need to make it a little bit more complicated and nuanced to understand it more.
Thank you. So Bharat, there are a lot of questions, but I think we'll end here. Do you want to take some, or what do we do?
What do we do? You tell me.
Sorry?
There are only 80 people left. I think we should let them leave also. Poor fellows. They've been at it for
Yes, I think. So what we'll do is these questions we'll take. We have all of their email IDs, so we'll probably reply to them. We'll take answers from you.
Sure.
These.
Happy to.
Yeah. But thank you so much, Bharat. It was such a wonderful conversation. I think this can go on for an hour and we'll not get bored. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the attendees. I think it's a pleasure to have such a large audience all the time when we do webinars. So please stay tuned, be safe, be at home, and continue to look forward to our conversations. The next one that we have is with Prayag Akbar. So Prayag is a faculty in writing, and he is actually a fictional author of a book called Laila. I don't know how many of you have read it, which is converted into a Netflix series. So he's with us on 20th. So stay tuned. But thank you. And thank you all.
Thank you, Vikram. Bye. See you guys. Nice meeting you all. Bye.